The next thing we'll talk about are various stages of an infectious disease. So as we go through these different stages, kind of reflect back on the last time that you were sick, and you probably recognize the progression of this. So it all starts off with the incubation period. The incubation period is the time between when you initially become infected with the virus or bacteria until the onset of the very first sign or symptom. So generally during the incubation period, you have no idea that you are sick, but a microorganism has invaded your body and it is beginning to grow. And once it grows to the point where it starts causing signs and symptoms, then you progress out of this incubation period. Every microbe has a different incubation period. For something like COVID-19, from the point someone got infected with the virus until the onset of the first sign or symptom, it was about a 3 to 5 day incubation period. And most infectious diseases tend to have about that as far as their incubation period. I mean, some are much faster. If you're talking about something like salmonella leading to food poisoning, I mean, the incubation period could be hours. It could be relatively fast. But then if you're talking about something like CJD, which is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a prion disease, I mean, that has an incubation period, an average of 15 years before signs and symptoms start. So it does vary, but in general, the time between when you first become infected until the initial sign or symptoms, that is classified as the incubation period. The prodromal period is when you would experience nonspecific and mild signs or symptoms. So the key words there being nonspecific and mild. This is waking up one morning and just having that feeling that something's not right. Maybe you have some mild body aches or you're just kind of fatigued, but I mean, those things are mild and they're very nonspecific. I mean, those signs and symptoms happen with a variety of different ailments. I mean, it could be COVID, it could be the flu, it could be some type of stomach bug. I mean, all different types of things. So it's nonspecific and it's mild when you're in the prodromal phase. And that period can last a day or two, and then you typically progress into the worst phase. The worst phase of them all is the invasive phase. So in the invasive phase, this is when you would experience all the signs and symptoms that are associated with that infectious disease. So if we're talking like COVID-19, you might have experienced like a low-grade fever and some body aches during the prodromal phase. But by the time we get to the invasive phase, maybe the fever's increased. Now you're having coughing fits, you're short of breath, maybe having chest pain, experienced loss of taste, loss of smell, those types of things. So in the invasive phase, you experience all the signs and symptoms that are characteristic for the infectious disease. Then we get to the decline phase. It is important to note the decline phase is not the decline of you. The decline phase is the decline of the pathogen. And that can mean one of two things is happening, or potentially even both. Typically, it means that the immune system is starting to kick in, and the immune system has activated to the point where it can get rid of the infection. So our immune system's starting to work. And then it can also mean that any medication that you've taken is starting to work too, or both of these factors. So if you're on an antibiotic or an antiviral during the decline phase, those medications would take effect, and the pathogen in your body would start to decline. So it is the decline of the pathogen, either because of medication you're on or your immune system. It is not the decline of you. And then the last phase is the convalescence period. This period can vary, but generally in the convalescence period, you no longer feel sick. Your body is just doing kind of internal repair. So it's repairing tissues, it's cleaning up any type of damage, and overall you're just strengthening and recovering. But for the most part, you feel otherwise healthy during this period, and your body is just repairing damaged tissue and kind of regenerating. So a big thing for microorganisms is that they like to spread from one person to another. So when they escape a portal of entry from one person, they immediately want to get into someone else's, when they escape a portal of exit, they immediately want to get into someone else's portal of entry. That's how they live, from jumping from host to host. So we have to talk about transmission. So as far as diseases, we can categorize them in different ways. So a lot of the diseases that we talk about in our course are communicable diseases. Communicable meaning they can be spread from one host to another. We do need to be able to differentiate a contagious disease from a communicable disease, because a contagious disease is a communicable disease. It is a disease that is transmitted from person to person. However, it is transmitted very easily from person to person. So the key word there is easily. Most of your respiratory pathogens are considered highly contagious, things like measles, COVID, influenza. Those are all highly contagious pathogens because that route of transmission is so simple, just through a respiratory droplet. Someone that has one of those diseases could cough, sneeze, or speak and expel mucus droplets with the virus within it, and could cause to several people becoming sick all at once. So it's a very easy route of transmission. Something like HIV. It's communicable, yes, it's spread from person to person, but for it to be spread, it obviously has to be a much more intimate point of contact. So it's not as easy to transmit as something like influenza or COVID that can be simply spread through a respiratory droplet. So contagious disease is just a communicable disease that's spread very easily, and this predominantly includes your respiratory pathogens. Then there are non-communicable diseases. Non-communicable diseases are diseases that are not spread from person to person, so they don't go from host to host. Opportunistic pathogens are one. Remember, opportunistic pathogens only affect those individuals that are immunocompromised. So immunocompromised people would be susceptible to an opportunistic pathogen. But if you were someone that's healthy and you were taking care of someone that was sick with an opportunistic pathogen, you likely would not get sick from them because your immune system is strong enough to block the pathogen from causing an infection. Toxin ingestion is another one. So, for example, if someone is sick and with a GI infection and is preparing food, and some of that fecal particle and bacteria like salmonella or staph gets into the food, and then you ingest it and get sick, you cannot make someone else sick through direct exposure to you. They would have to eat the same contaminated food source. So a lot of cases of bacterial food poisoning would be an example of toxin ingestion. Or even something like botulism. With botulism, a common way to get it is through eating contaminated food, specifically contaminated canned vegetables. So if you get botulism from eating contaminated canned vegetables, you can't give someone botulism that comes in contact with you. They would also have to eat from the contaminated food source. The last being environmental exposure. The best example of this is tetanus. If you step on something that is contaminated with the Clostridium tetani bacteria and end up getting a puncture wound and acquiring tetanus, you cannot give someone else tetanus through contact with you. They would also have to get a puncture wound from something contaminated with soil residue that has Clostridium tetani in it. So there are different classifications for transmission, but again, we're talking about microorganisms getting passed from one person's portal of exit into another person's portal of entry. And this can happen through two routes, direct transmission and indirect transmission. So we're going to spend some time talking about direct and indirect. So direct transmission is when an infectious agent is spread through direct physical contact or through droplet transmission. So by direct physical contact, I mean skin-on-skin contact. So you have to come in direct skin-on-skin contact with an infected individual, whether this be through a handshake, kissing, or sexual intercourse. So for example, if I am sick with influenza and I cough into my hand and then I go shake your hand and you get the influenza virus on your hand, and then touch your nose or mouth and inoculate the virus into your body, that's direct contact because you physically touched me. Droplet spread is a type of direct contact because mucus droplets are typically, when they're expelled, they're spread within a few feet, and then individuals would inhale those mucus droplets and get sick through that route. Because it is still within a few feet, it gets classified as a type of direct contact. But droplet contact occurs through respiratory droplets. So if someone's sick with a respiratory infection, measles, COVID, influenza, when they cough, sneeze, or speak, they are going to release mucus droplets that have the virus within. Those mucus droplets will be suspended within the air, and then any individuals within a close vicinity can inhale those mucus droplets and then acquire the infection that way. So droplet spread is a route of direct transmission through respiratory droplets. Then the second type of transmission is indirect transmission. So indirect transmission typically refers to microorganisms being spread either through airborne transmission, through vehicles, or through vectors. So airborne transmission is different from droplet transmission. Droplet transmission is when mucus droplets are expelled from a sick individual and then inhaled into another individual in order to acquire disease, but the infectious pathogen is within the mucus droplets. Airborne transmission is when the pathogen is just freely suspended in the air. It's not in a mucus droplet. So something like Bacillus anthracis that causes anthrax. If it is freely suspended in the air, not in a droplet, just freely open in the air, and then you inhale that, that's how you would acquire anthrax through airborne transmission. There's various different types of vehicles. Vehicles are just non-living objects that can transfer disease into a host. So, for example, food is a vehicle. If you would ingest food that was contaminated with bacteria, that food serves as a vehicle to carry pathogens into your body. Blood and bodily fluids that have been expelled from an individual and are now required kind of cleanup. If you come in contact with those and they get into a portal of entry of yours, that is a type of vehicle transmission. Fomites are vehicle transmission, and a fomite is any type of inanimate, non-living object that can carry pathogens like doorknobs, car handles, debit cards, cell phones. All of those things are considered fomite. So if I'm sick and I cough in my hand and I touch a doorknob and I leave, and then someone else comes in the room later, touches that same doorknob, that doorknob is a fomite that is carrying my infectious pathogens, and they can inoculate themselves that way. Even water can be considered a vehicle if it's contaminated with things like fecal particles. You drink that water, it carries the infectious pathogen into your body. And the last type of indirect transmission are vectors. Vectors are living organisms that can transfer disease from one person to another. Often vectors don't get sick with the disease, they just serve to carry it between hosts. The most common vector are insects, things like fleas, ticks, mosquitoes. So for example, if someone has malaria and a mosquito feeds off of that individual and obtains their blood, the malaria parasite is going to be within the mosquito. So then that mosquito is going to eventually go on and feed off of someone else. And when they do that, they are going to inject the malaria parasite into the next individual. So that's how that person would get malaria. But you can see the insects, which are the vectors, are transmitting diseases between hosts. So fleas can transmit things like the plague, mosquitoes, malaria, Zika virus, all different types of things with mosquitoes. Ticks can transmit things like Lyme disease. So these things kind of serve as intermediate living vessels that can support transmission between hosts.